Hello guys, this is CodeNCode and this is a lecture of Spring Boot course, right? In this course, we are basically building a backend service for restaurant app, restaurant web app, we should say, right? So in the eighth lecture, basically what we are going to do, we are going to add security to our web app. As far as you might already know that all of our endpoints are basically public. Anyone can access any endpoint and do anything they want. Any functionality that we have provided, anyone will be able to access to. That should not be the case. For example, you can add a new user to the system. That shouldn't be public. That API shouldn't be public, right? Only admin should be able to add another users, right? For example, any user, as of now, all of the endpoints are public, so any user will be able to add food item. That shouldn't be the case. Again, admin should be able to, or a specific type of user should be, for example, restaurant owner should be able to add new food items, right? That is the case. But as of now, all of the endpoints are public, so anyone will be able to do anything they want to, right? So what we are going to do in this lecture, we are going to add security aspects to our web app. So we are going to, secure certain endpoints, that these endpoints should only be accessible by the logged in user. These endpoints should only be accessible by a user who is admin, things like that, right? So we are going to add security to our project, and we'll do that using Spring Boot security, and you'll see how easy it is to add security to your web app if you are using Spring Boot, right? So yeah, let's dive in directly and let's get started. All right, so let's get started by adding the dependency for Spring Boot security. But before that, if uh, if I run the project, I just want to show you something. I've started the project, right? And there are so many public endpoints. So one of which is get all food items, right? So if I hit it, I'm getting the response. The response is empty because we haven't added any food item here, but it's working fine. We are able to access the endpoint, right? So we are able to do that. But let's see what happens when you add Spring Boot security, right? So just add a dependency, Spring Boot. It's a starter project, starter security, right? You'll get certain options. Add this one, Spring, that is from Spring Framework, right? You get this dependency, remove the versioning because Spring Parent will take care of it. All right. So we have added a dependency for Spring Boot starter security. So we've basically added security, right? So just refresh the dependencies. It'll add certain code in here, update the dependencies. Right. Once we are done with it, okay, it's taking a little bit of time. Yeah, we are done with it. So if I restart the project, you see, earlier I was able to access this endpoint, right? I go ahead and restart the project, right? All right, yeah, done. If I go ahead and try to do the same, see, I'm getting a login ID. Basically, I'm getting a page to sign in, right? Sign in this case. We have done nothing but just added a simple dependency, and Spring Boot takes care of a lot of things. So as we know, Spring Boot is an opinionated framework. So what it does, it knows that if you are adding security, you need this and this thing. So it configures those things for you without you having to do anything, right? And this basic login is part of that. So if you have added Spring security, it assumes that you might need a login page. So it has created that and also added it. So by default, what it does, by default, all of the endpoints are now secured. If you want to access any of the endpoints, you need to log in here. So now the question is, what is the user ID and the password? By default, the user ID is user. What about the password? The password is actually auto-generated every single time. If you see here in the logs, here, using generated security passwords, this is your password. So if you copy here, go back here, enter the password, sign in. You are able to sign in, and now you are able to access the endpoint. Now, one more thing, keeps track of the session. That means if I try to add, if we try to hit the same endpoint again, it won't ask you the user ID password. It has saved your credentials, right, in the session. And now you have a session. And as long as this session is there with the Spring Boot, you don't have to log in again and again and again, right? This is simple form login, right, which Spring Boot provides by default. You don't have to do anything. All you have done is added the dependency for Spring security, right? And now you have it, right? But since we are providing this as a RESTful service, right? So we don't want to have the form login. right? So let's go ahead and configure some of the things. For example, I only want basic basic auth, which basically requires user ID and password with the request, right? So there are so many things that I want to customize. For example, I don't want form login, I want basic auth. Basic auth basically user ID and password, right? I want that. And I don't want to basically add authentication on each and every endpoint, right? There are some endpoints which should be public. For example, if someone wants to visit your home page of your restaurant app, you want to show them certain food items, right? Those shouldn't be authenticated, right? Those should be public endpoints, right? So there are so many things that we want to customize. As of now, every single endpoint is authenticated as of now, right, by default. But I don't want that. I want certain endpoints to be public, certain endpoints to be accessed only by the admin, certain endpoints to be only accessed by the logged in user, right? Public, logged in user, and the public and the admin, right? So all of these customization I want to do, and I can do those customization on my own by providing a configuration, right? So Spring allows us to provide a specific configuration, and it will use that configuration to configure security for your project, right? So let's go ahead and see how we can do that too. All right, so before we add a configuration file, let's go ahead and make some changes in the project. For example, we have a user, right? User have ID, first name, last name, and email, right? These are the fields user have. I also want the user to have certain other things. For example, roles. Each user I want in the system to have certain roles. It can be user means a user of our system, right? And admin, right? If the user is admin, right? So things like that. So I want the user to have roles also, right? So let's go ahead and define a new table, roles. And also let's have a list of roles here in the user's entity, right? So if I go back here, let's create a new entity, name it role, right? So let's call it entity. I mean, annotate it with entity, and let's give it ID. So private long ID, right? And annotate it with @ID. And yeah, generate value identity, right? So basically generate IDs for this table, right? Table rows. So now we have ID. What else we need? Maybe role name, right? Call it name, or let's directly call it role. Let me role. All right. So we have ID, we have role. What else do we need? I think that should be it, right? So let's define alt insert getters and setters. We have getters and setters. Let's define an empty constructor, public role. Okay, empty constructor. We have this and this, right? Yeah. So what I want my users to have, I want them to have a list of roles. It could be anything like system user, admin, and another roles that we can define, right? So along with an email, I want it to also have list of roles. So list set list should be Java util list of roles. My bad. List of role, the role that we have defined here, right? CodeNCode food entity. This one. Now, since these are two different tables, we have to join them together, right? We have to define that what kind of mapping these to have, right? So, uh, of course, since this is a project, I won't go into much details of what mapping is. You can just Google it, right? And how do you define the mapping and how do you join the tables, right? So I'll cover it on the higher level, or the higher level of things, right? I can't go into much detail. So basically, I have list of roles here. I need to define what kind of mapping between these two table is one to one, one to many, right? Many to many, things like that. For example, so a user can have multiple roles, right? So one to many from user to roles. But if you look at from roles to user, a role can have multiple users also. For example, admin can have multiple users because multiple users can be admin, right? So it is a mapping many to many, right? So at the rate many to many mapping, and I guess I can define, yeah, fetch type eager. So what is this? So whenever I'm fetching a user, I want all of his roles to be fetched too, right? Eager means it's going to fetch the roles along with the users when we are fetching user, right? You can set it lazy also, right? And in that case, it won't do the same, right? It would only fetch roles when it is needed. So yeah, there is one more thing. Yeah, the join table. So basically, what Spring Boot will do now, you have to tell them how to join these two together, the roles and the users, right? That you can define using join table, right? So what it's going to do, it's going to create a different table, right, in which it's going to keep the mapping. For example, user ID 1 is mapped to role ID 1. User ID 1 is mapped to role ID 2. Basically, user ID 1 has two different roles. So this mapping, it has to store somewhere that you define using join table, right? So you can have name. What is the name of that map table? So we can call it user roles, right? Then we can have yeah, the other thing we can have is join table and uh, join table. Join, my bad, join column and inverse join column. So join column means which is the column that will be used to join these two tables. That will be our ID, right? So we can define it using @join column, right? In which we can pass the name, that is ID. That the name will be role ID, user ID. My bad. So basically, and referenced column will be ID. So what I did here is this. See, this is the join column. So which is the column that will be used to join these two tables together, and that will be our ID, right? Basically this will be the yeah, this will be used to map, right? In the mapping table, as I said, user ID 1 is mapped to role ID 1, right? Similarly, user ID 1 is mapped to role ID 2, user ID 2 is mapped to role ID 1. So what we need in the mapping table, we need two things: user ID and the role ID, right? That way you can tell which role is having which which user is having which role, right? That would be enough. So one of the column will be the ID, right? This is the ID. The referenced column is the actual column name, which is ID, right? And this is the name which will be inside the mapping table. So user ID, this ID will be known as the user ID there in the reference table. And then we have inverse join column, and then inverse join column. Yeah, inverse join column. So again, at the join column. Now, what is this inverse join column? So basically, the join column is the column that will be used to use in the reference table, right? And this is the ID of the owning table, which is this table, right? The table which is defining the mapping, right? So this is the join column, and inverse join column is the column details of the other table, right? And that would be named as, my bad, name role ID, because we'll be using the ID of the roles, right? So we'll have a table for referencing. It will have user ID and the role ID. So this is for the other table, inverse columns. So role ID and the reference column name is, if you see here, inside the role, it also has the name, column name ID, right? So ID. All right. Yeah. So we have defined the join table. So this will be used to join these two tables together, roles and user, right? So now, since we have defined the join table, what basically when you define many-to-many mapping, Spring Boot will create a mapping table, which is what we have defined here, user roles. What it does, it when you define many-to-many roles, sorry, many-to-many mapping, you have to define that here also, right? So just go back here. So my bad, each user can have multiple roles. That's why we have many-to-many mapping here, but each role can have multiple users also, right? So we have to define list of users. This actually surprised that Java control Z, yeah, Java util users. Now each role can have multiple users also, and here we'll also have many-to-many mapping, right? uh And here, since this is also many to many, right? So what Spring Boot will do, it will try to create a reference table for this also. We have to tell Spring Boot that we have already defined it. You do that using join column, and inside of it, you define one thing that is mapped by. That, okay, my bad, my bad. Inside the many to many itself, you can define the map by. Map by will tell that, hey, a reference table for this also have already been created, and it will ask by which column. So we can tell using the roles of the user, right? So it is the column is roles, right? Which in the table which has already defined the mapping. So mapped by roles, right? Mapped by roles. Okay. So this way, Spring Boot now won't create a new reference table for this also. Now Spring Boot will know that these two are actually connected, and there is only need of one reference table, and that will be done by this. So this is how, this is basically the change that is required for us to have roles also along with the user creation, right? So along with user, we'll also have roles, right? So let's go ahead and run it. And I think before that, I need to delete this user table. Delete user table. I'm actually forgetting the query. Should be drop table. Drop table name, and that would be world.user. World.user. Right. The reason I'm dropping it because there will be so many changes. I don't know whether there will be world.user doesn't exist. World.users. My bad. Yeah. The reason is I don't want to run. Yeah, successfully drop the table, right? So as you can see, we don't have users table, we don't have roles table. If we go ahead and start the project, hopefully we don't get any error, and these two tables should be created. Okay, good. If I go back here, refresh it, so see, we have roles, we have role table, we have users table, and we have the mapping also, user roles. And if you click on it, in the columns you can have user ID and the role ID, exactly what we have defined here, user ID and the role ID. So now what we have users which have multiple roles, right? Users will have list of roles that is not added here, and it will be fetched when you try to fetch the roles, because the mapping is defined here, so it won't be clearly inside here, right? We have already defined the mapping here. So we have role, we have only two columns, ID and the role name, basically, right? So now we have made the changes. So each time when I'm going to add a new user, here you can see add a user, I'm only providing the first name, last name, email. Now I'll also provide the use roles, right? And that roles will be saved along with this user, and you can see that the mappings will be created. As of now, there will be no mapping. So if I go ahead and print it, as you can see, this is empty, right? But when we add a new user with a new what to say roles, you'll see that mappings will be created for that user. All right, so let's go ahead and see that in action also, and let's make some changes to update, so basically to add new user along with the roles. All right, so let's go ahead and make those changes also. All right, so I want to have interaction with the role table, so let's go ahead and create a repository for role also. New Java class interface, let's call it role, my bad, role repository, right? At the repository, right? And it extends JPA repository, right? So I want to have it for roles, the role that we have defined, CodeNCode. Yeah, yeah. So we have defined a role, right? And okay, now what I want, whenever in the user controller, if you see here, this is the place when we are creating a new user, right? Here, save user. So this is the place where we are saving a new user. So now that we are trying to save a new user, we will also pass the roles. When we are passing the roles, it will have name like user, admin, and other roles, whatever you would like to define. We need to make sure that that role actually exists before saving it into the database, right? I don't want someone to enter XYZ as role and we save that. So we have to verify that role actually exists. So to interact with the role database, we need what we need. We need roles repository also. So auto wired private uh, yeah, role repository, right? So we have role repository also. Now before saving it, we will verify that the role is actually valid, right? So we'll have a list of roles and we'll verify that all of the roles are actually valid, right? So before saving it, we are saving it here. So let's verify it. So for each role inside user dot get roles. Okay, we haven't defined the getters and setters for the role in the user, right? So let's define getters and setters for alt insert getters and setters for roles, right? So go back to user service, get roles. Yeah, my bad. Get roles. Okay. This is a list of role. My bad. Yeah. So we have list of role, right? And now what we are going to do, we are going to verify whether this role is actually valid or not. So let's define a utility function here. Private. It won't be used outside. Boolean. Yeah. Is role valid, right? So we'll be given a role. So what we are going to do, we are going to fetch a role from the database, right? So optional of role, we have already named it role. So uh, fetch role, right? From the repository, we'll try to fetch the role by not ID. When we are basically trying to add a new user here, what you'll do, you'll provide roles also, right? And the roles will be this is a list, and list you provide using this, right? And each role you will provide its name, right? For example, name admin. This is one role. Another role, you can provide the name of it. See, the role only has two fields, ID and name. ID is being auto generated, you don't have to do anything, you just need to provide the name, right? So I want to add this role having two different sorry, I want to add this user having two different roles, which is admin and user. User means our system user, right? Logged in user, that is the user. All right. So what I'm providing only the name, so I can't fetch it by ID, right? And you don't expect someone to, and they are creating a user, to provide an ID, just the name, like admin or the user, right? So inside the role we'll have the name. So fetch by ID, no, find by name. Dot find by name should be find by name, right? All right. Role dot get name. Okay, okay. It's not name. Find by, we have named it role itself. So get role. So confusing. Find by role. Uh, find by role. It should be find by role. Okay, let's go back to role repository. It doesn't exist. So let's create it. Find by role. All right. So find by role we have defined here. Go back to user repository. We'll fetch it. Find by role. Role basically the name that you have provided, admin or user, whatever that is. So we are trying to fetch the role from the database using the name which is provided in here, right? While saving it. So what I'll do, if okay, if is role valid, I'm validating whether this role is valid or not. If this is valid, what I'm going to do, in here, let's create a list of roles, right? List of role is equals to new array list. I have an empty list of roles. If this role is actually valid, instead of, let's just go back here. This doesn't make sense, because once I validate that this role is actually valid, I need to save that into the user, and when I'm saving it, I must have the ID also. So I need to actually fetch the role. So I just don't want to make sure that this role is valid, I also want to get the details of it. especially the ID. So what I'm going to do is role fetched role is equals to repository dot find by role, and whatever role we have here dot get. It won't provide the role, it will provide optional of that, optional of role control set. Yeah, so I have that from the database. If it actually exists, it's fine. If it doesn't, we'll throw an error, right? So if is present, what I'm going to do, I'm going to add it into the list of roles. So roles dot add, yeah, the get role is present. What is that? I don't want to do that. Okay, if that is not the case, right, I'm going to throw an exception from here. Okay, what kind of exception? Invalid operation exception. Invalid. Okay, ID is not there, so invalid operation exception. I'm trying to add a role which doesn't exist, so it is an invalid operation. Okay, so let's throw an exception from here. Invalid exception, right? So we can throw from here, throw new invalid operation. Yeah, you can say role not found. And which one not found? So we need to tell that also, right? Role, which role was it? Role dot get role. Okay, so this is the role which is not found into the database. So we can throw this exception and we won't save the user. If we didn't find any exception inside the list of roles, we are adding the roles by fetching it from the database. And finally, the user, we can update the user with the roles, right? You might think that we are already providing the roles here to the user, but it doesn't have the ID and other details. If we add that into the future, right, those details are not here. So we have to fetch those roles from the database, so we get the ID and then add that here in the roles of the user, right? That's why I'm creating a new list of roles, fetching it from the database and then only saving it in here. Now when you save the user, you'll have list of roles along with the user, right? So if you run it, it will work fine, but we have an error in here. Yeah, throws invalid operation or exception, right? We had to change in the controller also. We have changed one thing only. As of now, we have updated the creation user uh, process, right? So that we also have the roles, right? And the valid roles, not just any random roles. Now, if someone provides XYZ, it won't work. So if we go ahead and run it again, right, and test it, whether it works or not, right, we'll get an error because we don't have any roles in the role table. If we try to even add admin, for example, here, yeah, okay, on unauthorized, because we have added Spring Security. So if I'm trying to add, if I'm trying to access this, it will throw an error, right? Because we need to provide user ID and password. As of now, let's just go ahead and disable the security. I'll enable it later. Spom.xml. As of now, just disable it. Once we make changes in here, control, yeah, refresh it and restart it. So we have removed Spring Security. I'll add that once we have users with role, right? Once we are going to write the configuration again. As you can see, the Spring Security has been disabled because no user ID, user password has been generated. So if I go back here, if I try to do the same, yeah, role not found, null, why null? Oh yeah, the name is, if you go back here in the role, right, the field name is not name, it's actually role. So we have to pass role, not the name, right? Role admin, role user. If I go back here, yeah, as you can see, 400 bad request, admin not found, right? Clearly, because admin doesn't exist. Let me remove this only and let me pass only user. So if I try to do that, user not found, right? So our endpoint is working perfectly fine. Let's go ahead and make some changes so I'm able to add admin and the user, right? So as of now, as you can see, in the roles we have nothing. We tried to fetch things here and it didn't work because there is no role here, right? This is okay, this is the mapped table. So if you go back here in the role table also, you won't find anything. ID, and let's add some details here. So let's say ID1 role is admin, right? ID2 role is user. This, so I've added two roles, admin and user. Let me just apply changes here. Done. So if you try to fetch roles, you will get these two. So now we have admin as well as user. So if I go ahead and hit enter now, you see 201. Now because I'm trying to add a role user and that user actually exists, that's why we have added a user by this ID. So if I go here, fetch user by ID, right, I'm getting the user, right, along with the roles. See, and if you go back here, earlier in the roles user roles table, we were getting nothing. If you see here, you have the user ID, which is UUID, and that's why it looks like messy. And then the role ID is 2. User ID 1 is mapped to role ID 2 because that is second role, user, right? So now we're able to add roles, add users with the roles. Now since we can do this, right, now we can do the other thing. For example, secure the endpoint, that this endpoint should only be accessible by user. User means logged in user. This user that we have created, assume this as the logged in user, right? When we say user, we mean logged in user. Admin, of course, nothing to explain there, right? So we have successfully implemented the roles here. So now the user will have certain roles. Now we can go ahead and implement the security in such a way that we can tell Spring Boot that this endpoint should only be accessible by user who is admin, right? Right, or this endpoint should only be accessible by a user who is logged in user, which is our user role, right? So we can tell Spring Boot that, and we can tell, yeah, let these endpoints be public so anyone can access them without even being logged in, right? So those changes, let's go ahead and do now.
Alright, so let's go ahead and secure our web app. So as for security, you can define what you can do. You can define a security configuration file, right? And using that configuration file, Spring Security will know that how you want to, configure your security for the web app, right? So let's go ahead and create a package called security. Security related files I'm going to store here, and then inside it you can define, I mean, it's not necessary you define a security package. I just do it to make it clean so and organized. So you can define a configuration file, call it security config, right? And in here you can define your configuration, and then Spring Security will know that this is configuration you want for your web app, right? So you can annotate it with @configuration, and also when you want to enable the web security, enable web security, right? These two annotations, and in here you can define the security configurations, right? So we'll do that in a moment. Before that, if you remember here in the role, what we are doing here, we are saving the username, first name, last name, ID, and email. Email will act as a username, but as you can see, we haven't stored the password anywhere, right? So let's make that change. So string password, right? We can add some annotations like it shouldn't be blank, right? You can add message like password cannot be empty. That should be all right. Now this is the password, right? So let's define getters and setters for this also. Alt insert and getters and setters for password, right? So now when we are saving a user, when we are adding a user, we are providing these details: first name, last name, email ID, and roles. Along with it, we also have to provide the password, right? We'll do that. Okay, so password, right? And then in here, in the user repository, not here, my bad, in user service, here we are saving the user, right? So one thing is that when you are going to save the user, you are also saving the password. When you are saving the password, it is recommended, is the worst idea that you save the password as it is in plain text form. You don't do that. If someone's password is root, you don't save root. You save some hashed value of that, right? So you encode it. So for encoding, you can use, just go back here. You can use some of the encoders that are provided by the framework itself. One of which is bcrypt password encoder, the most famous one. So you can define a bean of it, the bean, and in here you can provide the bcrypt password encoder, right? Return new bcrypt password encoder, right? So this password encoder you can use to encode the password, right? When you are going to save it in here in user service, you are going to save user here. So make sure before you are saving, encode the password, right? So what you can do, user dot set password is user dot get password. Oh, we have to encode it, right? So we need password encoder, so we can auto add it here. Auto add private password encoder. Yeah, so we'll get a password encoder from here, as we have defined password encoder here. Okay, we need bkip password encoder, call it encoder. We have defined the bean here in security configuration. So whenever we'll need bcrypt password encoder, it will be provided from there, right? So now that we have password encoder, you can encode the password. So password encoder dot encode user dot get password. Yeah, so you are getting the password of the user, encoding it, and then saving it into the database, right? So while saving it, you are actually encoding the password. As simple as that. These are the only two changes that we require to do, right? And we have the security config. Now we can enable the security, but before that, here's the thing. So when how Spring Boot security works, what we are going to do, we are going to enable, as you have already earlier seen, we got a form to log in, and then we were able to access the resources, right? We don't want that, as we are going to provide the services as REST endpoints, right? These will be RESTful services. So we don't want the user to provide user ID and password in a form login. They'll be probably sending from Postman or direct REST requests, right? So in that case, what we can do, there are many things. One of which is you can enable basic auth. In basic auth, in header, you provide your username and password, right, in each request. So for that request, the user ID and password will be matched against our database, right? We'll see whether this user ID and password exists in our database. Basically, that user exists or not. If it exists, you'll be basically you'll be logged in, right? And you'll be able to perform actions, or you'll be able to access the resources, right? So we are going to enable that thing first. To enable that, what we are going to do, we need to tell Spring Security that this is the way to fetch data from the database, user data from the database, right? Spring Security doesn't know that, so you have to provide it with the method to fetch details from the database, right? How you can do that? The way you can do that is by defining a user detail service, right? So what you can do, you can define a service, user detail service. You can implement user detail service, and in that you will get a function to load user from the database. As simple as that. So Spring Security uses user detail service, so you can provide an implementation of that. That hey, this is the way to fetch the data from the database. Spring Security will take that implementation and fetch the data from the database, user data, whenever it needs, right? So what you are going to do, you are going to define a new service. Let's call user details service. Let's call it IMPL, because we are going to implement user detail service. So implement user detail service, right? As you can see, user detail service comes from Spring Security core, right? Annotate it with service. Yeah, as you can see, we are getting some error because we haven't implemented the method. So you can just go ahead, alt enter, and then implement method. There's one method that you need to implement, that is load user by username. So basically, this implementation you will hand it over to Spring Security. whenever Spring Security needs the user details, it will use this method to fetch data. Now, whatever method you define here to fetch the data, that will be used whenever Spring Security needs user data, right? So what you can do, since you want to fetch user details from the database, what we need? We need a repository. So private, sorry, find repository, user repository. Yeah, we need user repository. Let's annotate it. App.wire. Yeah, user repository was the issue here. Field might not have been initialized. We are auto wiring it. Okay, so we have user repository. From user repository, you can actually fetch the user, right? So what Spring Boot will do, it will give you the username, because the user will give username and password. So Spring Security will give you username to fetch the user details. And when we fetch the user details, basically this user will also have the password, right? So Spring Security will match the password provided by the user against the password that we have fetched from the database, right? So where were we? Spring Boot. Yeah. So we need to fetch user by username. In our case, username is actually email, right? So in our user, if you see, we are using email and password, right? Email and password. So whenever Spring Security gives you username, it's basically email, right? So user, the user that we have defined is equals to user repository dot find by email. All right, find by email, and we can pass the username. Username is nothing but uh, email in our case, right? So if you go back here, user repository, I've defined a function, this simply find by email, right? Spring Data GPA will do the rest. It notes that it has to fetch details by the email ID, find by email, right? And we'll provide the email ID, and it returns optional of user, not the user itself. That's why we are getting error here. So optional of user, right? So what we can do here, just close this. So we need to check whether this was a valid username or not. If it is not a valid username, this will be empty, right? Because we won't get anything in the database, and we will get an empty result. So if it is present, we'll do something, we'll return the user. Else you can throw user not found exception, right? User not found exception, as you can see, it's already defined in Spring Security Core, right? So we are already provided with a proper exception. We can throw it like that. We can directly throw it from here. So we can throw an error, invalid username, right? We haven't checked the password, so we are not going to say that it's a invalid username or password. It simply say the user doesn't exist or invalid username. Simple. Yeah. Let's add a full stop also. Yeah. So and what if we fetch the proper user? Then you have to return a user detail. So this is not a random class, right? User details again is provided by Spring Security Core, right? So what is user detail? So user detail is at the center of Spring Security. This is basically the class which is used to hold user details like password, roles, its username, everything like that. And Spring Security uses this class throughout, right? So each time when we are going to fetch a user, right, from the database, Spring Security expects us to return user details. It's I believe is an interface. Yeah, it's an interface. So there are multiple implementations of it, right? One of which is user itself, right? User, you see, Spring Security Core user details, right? There is direct a user which is of type user details, right? So we can return that because it expects us to return a user details. What we are going to do, instead of returning that, what we can do in the security, you can define your own user details. User details, as you can see, is an interface. You can define your own implementation of that. So call it user details, right? Yeah. And you can implement user details. Once you do that, there are a lot of functions that you need to implement. Alt enter, implement methods, right? There are so many, but the others may be not required, but we are going to implement all of them, right? So yeah, we are going to do this. Let's define a constructor public my user details. We'll get a user, and we'll get user that we have defined, right, in the CodeNCode uh, uh, package. So we'll get a user, and then we'll convert it into user details. We'll get a normal user that we fetch from the database. We'll pass it here, and this class will convert it into user details, which Spring Security expects, right? In here, we need user details, right? So what we are going to do, we will pass a user here, normal user that we have defined, the user entity, and then we'll convert it into user details, right? So we can return it to Spring Security. There are so many methods that we need to implement. I'll explain that. So this will have private user, right? The constructor this dot user is equals to user. Now that we have user, we can return things like that. We need the password, so we can return user dot get password. We need username, we can return user dot get email, because in our case email is the username, right? And is account non-expired. So if you are implementing users in such a way that you may implement the expiration of account, you can return it from here. You can return that detail from here, whether this account is expired or not. In our case, we are not implementing neither account expiration, neither account locking, neither credential expiration, neither account disabling, unable to disable things, right? None of these things we are implementing in our database. So you can return direct true. Right. So is the account non-expired? Yes, the account is non-expired. Return true. Is the account non-logged? Yes, account is not logged. Return true. Right. Is credential not expired? Yes, credentials are not expired. Non-expired. Sorry. And is it enabled? The account is enabled. Yes, it is. So true. For all these methods, we can return true. Right. The only thing remain is to return a list of roles. Let's implement that also. So from here, as you can see, we have to return get authorities. Basically, these granted authorities are roles on a higher level. You can understand that. So we have to return roles, which should be of the type granted authority. So what we can do, let's define a list of granted authorities. Right, let's call them authorities. And since we have roles inside users, so we can get user.get roles. And for each role, we have to convert it into granted authority and add it in this list, right? So for each role, what I'm going to do, I'm simply going to add authorities.add. I'm going to do convert the simple role, right, into a granted authority. And granted authority is an interface, so we need one of its implementation, which is simple granted authority, I believe. Simple granted authority, you see. So what I can do is convert it to new simple granted authority, and it takes one parameter, that is role name. Let's close it here, and we can pass role dot get role. Get role will provide you the role name, and you are passing that into the granted authority. My bad, I'm having a hard time pronouncing it. So now that we have list of roles, we can return it directly from here. Done. So we have user details implementation of our own. When we are defining a user details service, we can actually return that because it expects an object of user details, and we have just defined it here, my user details. So I can return it from here. So if user actually exists in the database, we can directly return new my user details, and we can pass the user here, right? Let's remove it. Yeah, right. There's one more thing, the user not found exception, we haven't handled it. So handler here, common exception handler. So user not found exception, let's handle it here, right? Add the exception handler, and we are going to handle user not found exception, right? Response entity of string, of course. Handle user not found exception, we'll get a handle user not found exception, and then we can return response entity, right? With bad request user not found, we can return 404 not found, right? Because user not found. So status code 404, and we'll return the exception message that we have got, right? As simple as that. Yeah. Now if you see what we have done, we have define a security config in which we have not done much yet. This is an important place. We have to define a lot of things here, specifically security filter chain. Now, we have defined as a password encoder so that whenever we are saving the password of a user, we don't save it as a plain text, which is a really, really bad idea, but we are saving its encrypted form, right? Encoded form. And in the user, we have defined a user detail service that will be used by Spring Security to fetch user details so that it can match with the username password sent by the client, right? We have made some changes in the user service, one of which is password encoder, and while saving, we are checking whether user have proper password or not, as simple as that. And these are the changes we have made, right? Yeah, one more thing, we had added one new field, password, in here, right? And yeah, these are the changes that we have made so far. As you can see, we haven't defined anything into the Spring security part, right? I'll do that in a moment. Let's go ahead and simply run it because I want to see some of the changes that we have made into the database, one of which is this. In the users part, if you see, we don't have password as of now, right? And we have successfully, successfully the application started. So if I make some changes, as you can see, now we also have the password, right? All right, so we have added password into the database also. Now let's make some changes in here and let's now add Spring security, right? For that, you need to define a security filter chain, a bean that returns security filter chain, right? Now, in the earlier versions of Spring Boot security, to provide a configuration, what you used to do is you implement or you extend web security configurer adapter, I believe, right? If I'm wrong, let me, if I got the name wrong, let me know in the comment section, but I believe that was the name of it. You had to define a configuration which was extending web security configurer adapter, right? In the new version of it, you don't have to do that. What you have to do is define any configuration file. Inside that, you should provide a bean of security filter chain, right? As simple as that. So that security filter chain, using that security filter chain, you can configure a lot of things, right? You can configure things like what URL is public, what should be authorized, basically accessed by logged in user, what URL should be accessed by admin, or what URL should be accessed by someone having a specific role. You can define that too. Everything you can define here. And also you can add method level security, right? You can add security here on the methods of the controller. For example, I don't want, okay, okay, these are all changes. I don't want to see that. Okay, I'm not sure how to close this part. Okay, blame part, I don't know how to close, but just a second. So I was explaining that these are all of the methods. You don't want specific URL to be authenticated, or you don't want to define the configuration there. You can directly define configurations here, Spring security configuration, that this method, let's say someone where you are actually updating a user, you can actually add configuration here, security configuration, that you want this method to be accessed only by users having particular role. You can do that here too, right? So that is method level security. We'll do that here also, and we'll of course define the configurations, which is here. So let's go ahead and define the configuration and define a bean of security filter chain and see how you can actually implement security in. All right. So let's define the bean for security filter chain. So at the bean, security filter chain, security filter chain. And to define the bean of security filter chain, you need HTTP security object. That's why it is provided in here. Now, the security filter chain bean is the one where you actually configure the security for your application, right? So using this, what you can do, you can authorize the endpoints, right? You can tell what kind of authorization you need, form login or basic auth, right? And other things, right? And you can enable, disable other configurations, right? Like CSRF. So what you can do is http dot authorized request. Right? You are given an auth object using which you can write authentications. Right. So authorized request function, you can define authorization for your endpoints, right? URLs. For example, if you look here in one of the controllers, a food item controller, we are adding a food item, and this is basically public. Anyone can call this food item, add food item API, and can add a food item. That should not be the case. For us, what I want is that in the security config, I want this, which is the endpoint is slash food item slash add. This should be authenticated. That means on the very basic level, at least the user should be logged in, right? Later we can add that it should be an admin, but at the very basic is that auth dot request matcher. Here you can enter what endpoint you want to secure, right? Slash food item slash add. I want this for this endpoint. I want it to be authenticated, right? And as of now, let's go ahead and do this like dot any other request permit all. So basically authenticated will tell, hey, whatever is coming, whatever request is coming here must be authenticated. It should have proper user ID and password, and any other request permit all. I mean, we don't want any authentication authorization there, right? So in authorized request, you can define your authorization. Once you're done with that, you can define what kind of uh, authorization you want, form login or basic auth, right? So I'll go for basic HTTP basic, right? Customizer dot with default, right? So basically with defaults, I want HTTP basic authentication. So if you remember, we were getting a form login, right? You also have form login. So if you enable form login in the security configuration, you will get a login form to enter your user ID and password. Then you will be able to access the resources. But we don't want that here because we will be providing our services as HTTP requests, right? HTTP services. So as since we are providing it as an HTTP endpoint, so we don't want user to enter user ID and password. They can provide the user ID and password in the header. So in basic auth, you provide user ID and password in the basic in the HTTP header. So we don't want user login page. That's why I'm not adding it here. If you want, you can add form login. Right? It's up to you. So and then disable the CSRF security. This is the standard for REST and REST services, right? Because REST services are stateless, and this CSRF security is not needed there when you don't store any state information, right? These are stateless requests. There's nothing that we store about the request because each HTTP request, each REST request is independent of each other, right? We don't store anything here. So CSRF is not required. And after that, what you can do, why it is like that? Okay, so after that, what we can do, do we need, yeah, we need user service details. So there is a function for user service details also. I'm not going to do it here. Next slide. Okay, user service details. There's a method for user service details also, and you can add that here. I have already added a bean for user detail service because we already have defined a user detail service implementation. We can pass that implementation to the Spring Security and tell that, hey, whenever you want to fetch the user details, you can use this service, right? So using the user detail service, you can pass the user detail service and then build and return it, right? Build is a function. You build and get a security filter chain, and then you can return the object, right? So we have authorized the endpoint slash food item slash add, and any other request we are saying no need for authorization or authentication. And then we have added basic authentication. I'll show you how you can do that. And then CSRF, we have disabled it because REST services are stateless. We don't save any state information, right? So we are disabling it. And then we can provide the user details service. and tell Spring Security that use this user detail service to fetch data from the database. Then you can build the object and run it. As simple as that. So if I start the service, yes, all right. And if I try to add a new user in here, and as you can see, I have not provided any password, right? So if I try to do that, 403 forbidden, CSRF, my bad, CSRF, I need to disable it. So what was it? I forget the names of things very easily. Abstract HTTP configure, and then you can disable it. Okay, my bad. I actually passed customizer with default. I want to disable CSRF. If you don't disable CSRF, you might get 403 forbidden error. So go ahead, rerun it. We don't want CSRF. We want each request to be treated independently, and we want Spring Boot to assume that each request is a new request and there is nothing stored, no session information of each request is stored anywhere. All right. So CSRF is not possible. That's why we have disabled it. See, now we are getting the proper error. I haven't provided the password, so I'm getting an error that password cannot be empty. All right, it's working fine. Let's provide the password. Password. Let's call it root only. All right. I'm creating a user with CodeNCode, and email ID is CodeNCode only. Password is root. This will be a user. If I send it now, password cannot be empty. I'm passing the password. Yeah. So user is created. As you can see, the password is root. In the database, if you fetch all of the user, this is the one that we just added, CodeNCode, not iCodeNCode. Here is the password. You see, this is not in plain text. The password was root only, but we have said this thing, which is basically the imported form of root, and it's huge. If I copy paste, if only I will show you here. See, this is the password, right? Because the root have been encoded into this, and this is the way you should store the password. So even if the database is compromised, the password are not. All right, only the hashed values is there. So right, so now if you remember the food item, we have added an authentication there, right? They should be authenticated. If I try to add a burger now, I'm getting 401 unauthorized because this endpoint is now requires you to be authenticated, right? So how you can add authentication? Here you can go the authorization and go for basic auth. Remember, we have added HTTP basic authentication. So in here you can go to basic auth. You can provide user ID and password. User ID is CodeNCode only, and password is root, right? Root. If I send it now, see, I'm able to create a food item, right? The food item burger has been added. We are getting 201 create. This way you can add Spring Security to your Spring Boot project. As simple as that. You can add other authentication in here if you want to. And there's one more thing that we need to discuss is you can tell Spring Boot Security that this endpoint that we just secured, food item controller, right? Add food item. This should not be accessible to just any logged in user, right? As of now, we have authenticated it, so it will be accessible by any authenticated user. If you want to add secure to a specific method, you can do that. You can do, first of all, you need to enable in the configuration method level security. Here, see, I'm already getting a prompt. Enable, okay, not this one. Enable method level security, method security, right? Enable method security. So now we have enabled method level security. Now you can go to the controller methods. For example, this one, which is used to add food items. I can say @pre-authorize. So pre-authorize will run before executing the body of this function, right? Pre-authorize. It will authorize before execution. So I can tell that this method should be accessible to only those who has role admin. Anyone who has the role admin, those only should be able to access this. So if I run it again, as you can see, the user that we have just passed has only user role, right? Has only user role, not the admin role. So if I try to access this now, I should not be able to. Do I do this? 403 forbidden. All right. I'm not able to access it now because this is only accessible by admin, right? So to show you that yes, this works actually, go back to the controller. Instead of admin, let's go for user, because the user with which we are trying to access it has user as a role, right? So now that user should be able to access it, right? So this is up and running. Let's go here. Let's call it burger one. Okay, 403 English. Have I not provided everything is right? Yeah, it shouldn't be 401. Okay, so we have tried to fetch something from the database, and user ID and password should match because we have provided the exact user ID and password that we provided in the last. Okay, okay. Might be because of this. Doesn't have user has role, and just go back to the user details service, right? In here, the place where we were providing, yeah, authorities. Just one thing, when you are adding an authority, unfortunately at some places this might get confusing even for me. at In some places you need to provide the role underscore prefix before the role, and in some places you don't. For example, the controller that we just added food item, here you don't have to provide role underscore uh, prefix, right? And but in some places you might need to, which is this uh, user detail service, right? In here we need to, and that's the reason why we are getting exception. Even though it has the role user, we are still getting the exception, and unfortunately you won't get much details here in the console also. So if we rerun it again, so while we are creating authorities to provide it to the Spring security, right, we need to add role underscore prefix. We are getting the role user and admin, it should be role underscore. At some places it must be, at some places it is not required. So let's go ahead and run it again. See, so it is a bit of confusing. It's a bit confusing that to some places you have to provide the role underscore prefix, like when you are creating an object of my of user details to hand it over to Spring Security. When you are adding authorities, you need to add a prefix of role underscore. In other places, like we have added here in the controller, you don't have to. In fact, just to test, in fact, I had tested it once. If you provide role underscore, it will throw an error. I think, let me just clarify it. I think I was testing it and I got an error, but let me just verify it. If I go back here, try to access here. Okay, it doesn't throw any error, but there was one place I have seen that. I don't know which one was it, but here you can see you can provide, and you can add the prefix, and you don't add the prefix, doesn't matter. But in here, when you are defining the user details, and if you don't add role underscore prefix, it might throw an error. And there is one place where you actually, when you add the prefix, it will throw an error. I have seen, I just forgot where. I'll let you know in the comment section. All right. So yeah, this is how you add Spring Security. Huge uh, it was a huge lecture because I had to go through each and every aspect of it. But when you're going to add it to your project, it doesn't take more than half an hour for of course the college kind of projects, not the production one. There it will take a lot of time. So if I summarize it, what you have to do, you have to define, first of all, you have to save the user ID and password into the database, which we were already doing. We were not saving the password. Now we are saving the password. So save the user ID and the password into the database. Don't save the text version of it, right? Save it, save the encoded version of it. You can use bcrypt password encoder for that, right? You have user ID and password. Now using that, you can enable the login, right? To enable the login from your database, you have to define a user detail service, right? Spring Security uses user detail service. It is an interface. You can provide an implementation of it. That's exactly what we are doing here. You provide an implementation to fetch the detail from the database. That's the only purpose of this class, right? Once you have that, you can go ahead and define the configuration. You can define the password encoder so that you can use it to store the password of the user safely, right? And then you can define security filter chain, which is basically your configuration for security. You can define which URL you want to authenticate, which you don't want, right? So I have only added authentication for one of the endpoint. You can add for all of them. It's only going to make the lecture longer without serving any other purpose, right? So that's why I'm not adding other endpoints. But to add it, it's literally the same. Just go ahead, do dot request matcher, and then dot authenticated or permit all, right? It's all the same. So you define the security filter chain bean in your configuration file, enable it using enable web security, and if you want method level security, you can enable that also and add method level security. Like this method should only be accessible by those who have user role, right? This is how you add Spring Security and secure your web application, right? So yeah, this is it for this lecture. Thank you guys for watching. Until the next video drops, keep coding.